Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of Sunday, June 9th, 2024. Today, we are going to have a fascinating conversation about how science and technology can help to address the problems of depression and anxiety in an informed manner. And these are problems that affect many people throughout the world and greatly diminish quality of life. So hopefully we will have some innovative solutions that can be discussed and potentially applied in ways that do not have some of the deleterious effects of the contemporary mainstream paradigm. So joining us is our distinguished panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Visual Art and current Vice Chairman, our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer, and our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg. And our guests for today are the co-founders of HappyDAO, a DAO or decentralized autonomous organization attempts to use the principles of decentralized coordination of efforts and knowledge in order to achieve specified goals. And our co-founders of HappyDAO are Andreas Melhede, Nahu Dimitri, and Namkhai Ferdaña. Welcome, Andreas, Nahu, and Namkhai. Tell us about HappyDAO and your efforts. Andreas, I know you have a presentation, so please feel free to begin.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. We really all appreciate it. And today we want to highlight how HappyDAO can be a way to create a happier world and how we are looking to achieve that and the fundamental issues that highlights why we exactly need to solve this as soon as we possibly can.
Yeah, and a quick thank you to Gennady and the Transhumanist Party. We really appreciate you guys having us on today. Truly.
Of course.
So just to give a sort of high level on what we're trying to do, I'm sure as most people are familiar with, we have a really big problem going on in the medical R&D landscape when it comes to developing and commercializing new medications for depression and anxiety in specific. Here we put a little overview of a few medications that are most widely used across all areas globally. You have the second generation antidepressants, which is your SSRIs and your SNRIs. And then you even have the third generation ones, such as bupropion, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's Wellbutrin. So pretty much how we got started about this is we did a lot of research. We've read a ton of papers, meta-analysis, and so forth on the efficacy of these medications and how they affect patients in the real world. And what we found is that most of the effects that these medications produce are mediated mostly by placebo. There's a big book on this. It's called The Emperor's New Drugs by Irving Kirsch. I recommend everyone go read that book. He pretty much goes into a lot of the FDA literature and shows what hasn't been published by the pharma companies when they brought these drugs to market all those years back. And the results are astonishing. And I'm sure everyone here, or most people at least, have if they're not taking them themselves, they probably know someone who's on one of these medication classes. And most people it just doesn't work for most people in terms of side effects. They've actually been dubbed active placebos, meaning that the positive effects that come from these drugs is mediated through placebo, while the negative effects are very prevalent and affect quality of life. So our sort of ethos is being set up around creating better medicines for patients, particularly small molecule drugs. Andreas, do you have anything to add to that? You're muted.
Thanks. No, I think it's a good highlight of some of the issues that we are seeing right now in the world. And I think also just another like small aspect is also to mention how much this has worsened over the last just 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
This prior to COVID and during and following COVID, there have been millions, hundreds of millions of people that started suffering from these diseases. It's insane how much this has dramatically increased recently, and this just highlights how we have to stop this before it becomes even worse. And we need to find these novel drugs that are focused on the patient outcomes, on the actual patient and solving these issues for them. And as you can see here on the slide right now, you can see that there is actually a pretty good budget for mental health disorders, but out of this 2.1 billion, only about 65 million is actually about small molecule drugs that can actually be new solutions for depression and anxiety. And we clearly need some new solutions. Yeah.
And if you go ahead, and anyone who wants to check out the National Institute of Mental Health, it's pretty much the NIH's, it's like an NIH agency that oversees mental health grant allocation and everything related to depression, anxiety, ADHD, whatever it is. Only a very small amount of this funding has gone towards early stage research on small molecule drugs for depression and anxiety. And when you look even further into it, there's a lot of redundancies and things that have just been sort of perpetually been talked about for a long period of time now. And we don't think that this is contributing to meaningful scientific progress in creating new drugs and new solutions for patients in the real world. So one critique we had when we were reading through the literature was there's been a lot of media hype and a lot of people talking about ketamine. Intranasal ketamine therapy has been a relatively new thing in this space. And it's just not sufficient. From what we've learned, it's not sufficient in the long term. Obviously, you can't take ketamine every day. That's not possible. So the effects sort of start to taper off. And right now they're studying new devices that end up sort of exacerbating the effects of ketamine therapy, and as well as a lot of stuff surrounding cognitive behavioral therapy and other sort of non-molecule related interventions for depression and anxiety. We think these are great, but we think the root of this is a lack of good medications on the market. And Andreas, if you want to go back to that last slide, actually, yeah. Or no, the other one.
I don't know how you go back.
Wrong.
Okay. I think I got it now.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so like we were saying earlier about the second and third generation antidepressants and anxiolytics in terms of small molecule drugs, that is. I was recently reading a research paper that came out last year in Saudi Arabia, where they went through and they assessed the quality of life sort of boosts that came from taking these medications. And they found that there was absolutely zero positive outcomes in terms of quality of life for patients in the real world. And that was accompanied by a complete absence of patient-reported outcomes. In other words, what you get is you get researchers sort of assessing outcomes for patients rather than patients assessing those outcomes themselves. And obviously, as many of us know, when you take an SSRI, it could give you loss of libido, emotional blunting, weight gain if you're on an SNRI, and so on and so forth. And we just our mission is being built around this in specific, in that these things have really negative implications on people. Even if it does make you feel less sad or whatever, it's just really not going to give you a net positive effect in your quality of life. And that's something that we're really focused on solving here with HappyDAO. If you want to go to the next one.
Yeah. So as you also alluded to, Namkhai, about, so our primary focus in terms of this is we want to focus on the early stage research on these novel small molecule drugs, both antidepressant and anxiolytics. And this whole funding piece where we have almost nothing going towards that shows that we need to reinvent this. And if we create a DAO where we can have millions actually coming into these new solutions, finding new startups, new research projects all around the world that are actually fighting for trying to find these new novel drugs. And if we have a community of thousands of researchers, ideally we want to have every single researcher that is studying depression and anxiety on board to help evaluate this, because if we have a collective of all of them researching the best new solutions, then our chances of finding the best one for patients is extremely high. So the whole community piece surrounding this is a key driver, and is a big part of why the DAO approach is really powerful for us, because we want to have the patients to get the biggest benefit possible. And also the whole thing about the stigma that is happening concerning the mental health issues that people have, where they're hiding what they have and they might seem to be happy on the outside, but then on the inside, actually, they are not happy at all. And they might actually be depressed and have a lot of anxiety in the background, or they might experience it or show it when they're alone, but not able to show it to anyone else. So they don't get the support that they actually need. And we want to create this. We want to have we want to create the biggest community on this to get the support together, and have millions of people that are basically fighting for better solutions and get the support they need. And the thing with, of course, new development of drugs is that it can take a long time for that actually getting into humans and actually giving patients benefits, which is also why we also want to be able to offer different services and products that can potentially help them right now, instead of them having to wait for the clinical trials to conclude. So we have the support piece of them all being together. We have the products, and we have the services, and we have all the researchers fighting together for finding these novel treatments. And then, of course,
that's right,
when these treatments are found, we are basically getting IP on that, which will then go back to the DAO, so we can find new treatments, and we can find new research and new projects that are fighting for this.
Yeah. So what we have here is, this is essentially a flywheel. So we have a community area. We have our Discord server where patients in the real world will be interacting through, sharing anecdotes with one another, sharing stories. I noticed someone on the comments here talked about the cultural system of that sort of underlies depression and anxiety. That's a really relevant point, and that circles back around to what we think is going to be what ultimately pushes this field forward, being patient-reported outcomes. And we can sort of cultivate that through this model here, where there's financial incentives for people involved. There's all sorts of different taxonomies of people, so to speak, like biological taxonomies, phenotypes, whatever, of people who suffer from very specific types of depression and anxiety. And then we also have researchers on board that will specialize in those fields to bridge knowledge gaps. So then people can make more informed decisions when voting on what to fund. So we sort of have a flywheel here, sort of a one-stop shop, access to products and services, community support, education, and then we can pretty much take all that knowledge we're cultivating here and we can put it to action and make something happen in the real world with it.
Definitely. And one thing I also want to mention is that we're also able to get a lot of data from this as well. So if you have a community of millions of people, we can basically incentivize these people to share their data, and that can actually be used for clinical trials as well as used for funding decisions for better assessing which novel drugs to research and to fund as well. So the whole community piece, the whole patient piece is a core lever of all this that really makes everything basically flying around this flywheel. And our core focus is indeed to provide better outcomes for the patients in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Very well said.
Yeah, and so here we have a few resources if people want to follow along. We have our community. We started on Discord. We just launched it actually a few days ago. So we're starting to get more and more people in here to start to discuss these issues and start to get the support that we are seeking to provide people with. We have our Twitter. We're very active in sharing things that are happening in the industry and about the project and everything regarding that. And then also for us, collaboration and feedback is really important for us. So we have this feedback form as well here to the right that basically gives anyone the ability to come and provide feedback about the project, about anything we should do better, we should change, we should start doing, we should stop doing. We really want to collaborate. We really want to get as many people included in this and building this in the best way possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Feel free to submit feedback or do any of that stuff. Well, we'd really appreciate it. It definitely helps us refine our mission here and make better decisions.
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation. It was quite informative and quite promising with regard to HappyDAO's approach to what has now been a long-standing problem. And I want to highlight an article that I originally wrote in 2002, so 22 years ago now, called "The Harms of Psychiatric Drugs in Public Schools," because I was seeing this when I was in high school, where it seemed like the default approach to any sort of divergent behavior was to try to medicate it. And that could be either if a student wasn't feeling good about something, whether it was sadness or anxiety, or if that student was causing trouble by some definition, and that could be actual trouble, or that could just have meant that that person was different. So it was such a troubling paradigm to me that I compared it at the time to how the party in George Orwell's 1984 behaved with regard to suppression of people who were different from the conventional mold, but also the fact that a lot of these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, seem to provide no real benefit but had considerable side effects was not lost on me either. And just a quick look at the Wikipedia entry will show you all of the various side effects. So this is not some sort of minority or marginalized or anti-scientific view. These side effects have been extensively studied by the mainstream scientific community, and they have been documented. And Namkhai, you mentioned some of them. There are various others. So the side effect of emotional blunting, which you did mention, is one that's quite concerning because it changes a person's character. Really, one's balance of emotions is kind of integral to one's personality and maybe even one's sense of identity. There are adverse vision side effects. There are possible bleeding side effects, fracture risks, suicide risk is a big one. And of course, one of the facts that was well known even in 2002 was that a lot of the early school shooters, and it saddens me to call them early school shooters because there have been so many school shootings since that time, had been on Prozac. And this is unfortunately a tendency that not that many mainstream media outlets talk about, but it has been well documented in the scientific literature. So I really applaud what you're doing now in trying to provide better options for people with anxiety or depression, people who may be experiencing very real suffering and want to find relief from that suffering. But I'm curious, for people today, what would you say are the best alternatives to SSRIs? And what would you say is a good transition path for people who happen to be on them already to get off of them and hopefully find a more balanced, more sustainable approach toward treating their conditions?
One thing that I've seen to be a very effective solution for people today in terms of what they can access is actually psychotherapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy in particular has been one of the more effective treatment solutions for those with depression and anxiety. And I sort of just want to circle back around to what you talked about earlier as it pertains to small molecule drugs. We really want to create a distinction between this being a moral issue and then this being an issue of science. There's a lot of anti-psychiatry sentiment out there. And although I understand it, given the inefficacies of the drugs on the market today, we really believe that there's going to be better medications out there in the future and better solutions for people as far as it goes with small molecule drugs, right? Right now, it's actually been shown that psychotherapy is more effective than pharmacotherapy for patients who have depression and anxiety. And we think that that shouldn't be the case. We think that medication should be, looking at it from a purely pragmatic point of view, we think that medication should be more effective than psychotherapy, but it's not.
Yes, and I think this speaks to the complex nature of some of these conditions, because it really does matter what one's outlook on the world is. And even if there's a biochemical basis for depression or anxiety, often that hasn't been so clearly pinpointed, especially in a particular individual, that one could go in with a medication that, as I understand it, essentially does area damage, and it will adversely affect the good components of one's brain's functioning as well as the bad ones. And as a result, you have all these side effects, but you are not necessarily addressing the root of the problem. But talking to someone about their issues and what they may be experiencing and how they may be viewing the world could definitely help them essentially direct their response to particular stimuli or particular events in their lives in a more constructive manner. So I can certainly see how that kind of therapy that involves essentially reasoning through issues can be more effective than just a chemical fix, at least with our current knowledge.
Right. And that brings up another interesting point. In that the medications today that are currently on the market, they have not been built to address certain phenotype clusters of different forms of anxiety and depression. Obviously, anxiety and depression, they're very broad categories, so to speak. So you could have all sorts of phenotype clusters. Someone might have OCD, another might have PTSD. Both of these officially categorized as anxiety disorders, while another person has social anxiety and another person has generalized anxiety, right? So a big thing for the future that we see becoming more and more talked about in the community is the potential to have phenotype-specific medication options. We need treatment options that address people with specific problems. And right now, that's not the case.
Yes, indeed. And it does seem all too often everybody who is classified as having some very generally described condition like depression or anxiety is given one of a few standard prescriptions, and this
Exactly.
ignores all of these
Right.
phenotypic differences. So that definitely does need to change. And we've had an interesting discussion as well in our internal chat. So Ben Ballweg asked, with regard to your slide that discussed $65 million of funding for small business, presumably Big Pharma isn't getting the NIH assistance for their mental health therapy development, and academic institutions are not included in that 65 million either. Nahu wrote that sadly, Big Pharma has put their focus toward anti-cancer and weight loss drugs, and those are of course not bad drugs to pursue, but I think one reason why Big Pharma is pursuing them is because they've had some very prominently demonstrated efficacy with Ozempic, for instance. Ozempic has side effects, but it has helped a lot of people in the very short term. And Nahu also writes, Gennady is 100% right, most mental health diseases are multi-genetic and are often diagnosed a bit late. So Nahu, I'm wondering if you would like to comment more about this. Also, how you got involved in HappyDAO. I know that you studied medicine, actually, and I'm curious what some of your observations have been about the shortcomings of the current system with regard to mental health and how that can be improved.
First off, thank you guys for having me here, and apologies for the Wi-Fi difficulties earlier. But yeah, Johnny, when you're in the clinic and you see that the way mental health patients, in fact, they're just kind of put off to the side and are often can be, how should I put this? Sometimes they think that they come in, or it's honestly up to the clinicians as well, because mental health has had been frowned upon for so many years and hasn't frankly been taken seriously. Only now over the last 10, 15 years, and especially since COVID, have we seen people begin to appreciate the differences between long-term depression, short-term depression, what are the reasons for it. Complaints now about pipelines for new drugs not really coming up. So, we've seen a lot more personally as well. We've seen a lot of psychiatric residents, more spots opening up around the US. So there is a demand for it. And to echo what I had said earlier, the problem right now is traditional pipelines for R&D in American businesses, because Ozempic, right? So all pharma is trying to sort of take a piece of that pie, leaving mental health on the sideline. And this is why we like decentralized science as a whole, because it allows for the patients to use essentially, their token or their, your money in your pockets, to push for and advocate for what you want to do. And so we'd like to see more of, we just like to see more clinicians get involved. Right now, we're starting to see more scientists, kind of pick up into the DeSci space. I myself, as an example, and it's no longer considered fringe. Now these things are starting to come up. I've been involved in the DeSci space more or less for the past 2 years, but only over the past 6 months have you begun to see people really understand the power of what we're doing here.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. We have seen a flourishing of decentralized autonomous organizations. I know, Andreas, one of our previous virtual enlightenment salons was with CureDAO, and then there's, of course, VitaDAO, which is prominent in the longevity space, Longevity DAO, and various others as well. And I think it would be good to delve into the model, the operating model of HappyDAO, and how in particular you would plan to attract funding for various innovative research projects, and how would you choose which projects to fund as well? What's the decision-making mechanism there?
Yeah, so I can start a bit on this. So of course, for us to have to make the best decisions in terms of finding the best projects to fund, we need to be very innovative in our approach, and we need a lot of researchers to evaluate this. This is why we have this goal of creating this huge community where we have ideally every single researcher working in the field that can help evaluate these projects. Because if we have one researcher or 10 researchers versus thousands, there's going to be a huge difference in terms of the efficacy of these drugs and the chance of them actually going successfully through all the trials. So for us, the whole community piece and having all these researchers collectively find these novel drugs is what you want to focus on. And of course, for finding these different projects, we have to go through some institutional channels, like contacting different universities as well, going through TTOs, tech transfer offices at universities to get different deals to evaluate. But also, there are also different startups from people that have previously worked in traditional academia and have started something on their own, because the whole issue is that when they're working in these universities, if they don't have a lot of credibility, they basically get pretty much no benefit at all from the research, even if they actually come up with the idea and the hypothesis and everything regarding it. So that's the thing too, that these traditional researchers, they realize that even with them making potentially a really big impact in the world, they actually don't really benefit much from it. So the incentives aren't there, which is also why the whole growth of DeSci is amazing, because it actually puts the incentives back on the actual value that's created. So all the researchers that are actually finding these solutions, they can actually benefit from this. So when we're working with researchers directly that are setting up new projects, then we can actually give them some of these some of this IP or some of these tokens that can actually give them direct value, instead of having every single part of that taken from the university they're working for, and then just getting involved with a small paycheck, even if they actually come up with a groundbreaking discovery.
Yes, thank you very much, Andreas. And it does seem like reaching out directly to researchers and working with them would be the most promising way to actually arrive at some truly innovative treatments, because contemporary institutional gatekeepers can really prevent a lot of useful information from disseminating to the general public, because they start having concerns like intellectual property or control over the research, or whether the research fits their broader agendas, or whether it's mainstream enough, or whether that fits their institutional goals. So I think reaching out to the researchers directly is the best path. Now, we do have some interesting comments in our YouTube chat. Brent Ellman, who is our secretary, writes, "This definitely sounds interesting." He also writes, "SSRIs definitely wreak havoc on the body. He has seen it secondhand numerous times." And Alan Crowley wondered, what effects did Brent notice among SSRI users? And Brent said he saw it make people's depression and BPD worse. And I think BPD in this case stands for bipolar disorder. It ultimately just made some people he knew more unbalanced. It made them feel even more out of control. And Mike Lazine asked, well, what about the Columbine shooters? Were they on any antidepressants? And it turns out at least one of them was. Eric Harris was prescribed an antidepressant medication called Luvox, and this is a CNN article from 1999.
That's SSRI.
Yes. Yeah. So, indeed, the most notorious school shooting, at least as of that time, could have had an SSRI as a contributing factor. Now, Siba Chamuza, who is our foreign ambassador in Togo, writes, according to his little experience in psychiatry as a trainee nurse with the perspective of a health sociologist, neither the human psyche nor the mechanism of medications are yet well understood. And I'm curious to hear everyone's comments on this, because that has been my intuition as well, that at least in contemporary psychiatry, there are certain hypotheses, but it's not really possible to take an individual and say, you are behaving in this way, or you are experiencing these feelings because there is this particular process happening in your brain right during those times that is triggering that. It's rather a much more approximate approach where the DSM-5, for instance, has certain empirical indicators, and if enough of them are met, then you're classified as having this disorder, even though nobody is actually even doing a brain scan to measure the activity in your brain. And just based on this external observation, sometimes psychiatrists prescribe medication, and that seems to be such a crude approach to me, but I would invite comments.
Yeah, and this is something that we agree with, by the way. The mechanisms of depression are not fully understood, and this is why we're looking to put more emphasis on patient-reported outcomes rather than clinician-reported outcomes. So then patients can actually attest to the efficacy of different drugs. And then it sort of goes hand in hand with our philosophy on addressing different phenotype clusters and specific types of depression and anxiety, so to speak, that people may be dealing with. And as far as the greater community goes, we've also noticed an ecosystem problem where you have half of it is being sourced from academia, NIH grants, and so forth. And then the other half is sort of being completely privatized, where you have a drug company that's doing all the research in-house. And we really think that one of the main outcomes that we hope to achieve with HappyDAO is to sort of reinvent that and put ourselves in a position to where we're able to set new industry standards. All of this is going to be open. This is open research. This is going to be stuff that everyone can see, everyone can contribute on. Even bigger drug companies can come on and look at the research we're doing and use that to supplement their own pipelines.
Yes, indeed. I do think that is quite a bit more promising. And Mike Lazine also writes it makes a lot of sense to talk to patients instead of the doctors. And he thinks the doctors may be tempted to lie for numerous reasons. I don't think most doctors would intentionally lie, but I think the incentives of the current system may lead them in certain suboptimal directions. For instance, we know a lot of doctors get approached by pharma industry reps and they get told, well, come to this nice dinner and learn about our wonderful new medication. And if they entertain the pharma reps often and go along with these medications that are being marketed to them, they get taken to more nice dinners. And that may be a kind of subtle motivator, but it's there nonetheless. And I think a lot of doctors also think, what is the standard of care? What is the approach that they could apply that they wouldn't get faulted for? Because in the legal liability system, if the doctor says, well, I was using the standard of care, that's a protection against malpractice liability. Even if there's a bad outcome for the patient, the doctor can say, well, there are bad things that happen in medicine. I couldn't have foreseen that. But I think it is important to recognize that there's so much we still don't know. And hopefully with more precise science, we will learn to a greater extent what works and what doesn't. Daniel Tweed, who is our vice presidential candidate, wonders, choosing what molecule research to pursue or fund would seem to be well suited to assistance from or with machine learning or AI. Would you agree with that premise?
Most certainly, yeah, 100%. I think that's going to be a big thing in terms of drug discovery, and all sorts of early stage research will be using algorithms. We've already, I think, a new version of AlphaFold came out, which is Google's platform for essentially expediting drug discovery using machine learning and AI. That's more so of a lab side thing in terms of the actual lab techs and how they approach doing that with the different tooling and whatnot. So that's more so something that happens on the back end. But yeah, we see big potential there. And just to sort of loop back around, and I think someone said something about new molecules somewhere here in the chat. And we have noticed that there is somewhat of a paradigm shift that is underway right now in the pharma industry. I think in 2020, it's called brexanolone. It's an allopregnanolone drug, was approved for postpartum depression. So we're already sort of starting to see more specific treatments becoming available for patients. Whereas, 10 years ago, if you had postpartum depression, you just get an SSRI. Now we have a solution for that. Now medicine has a solution for that certain depressive phenotype cluster.
Yes, thank you. And indeed, more precise, more targeted, more specific solutions would be areas where machine learning could greatly help, but also just more dedicated and discerning research could help.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we have some additional comments. Jason writes, he does not remember a lot of kids being on medication when he was in school. So probably, I would say, around 15 years before I was in school. And he thinks today they might have medicated him, but back then they just didn't let him have chocolate milk. And Jason, I think the approach of school administrators back in your time in school was a lot more reasonable, because I think at that point they realized for many kids and teenagers, most issues were behavioral in nature, and they could be addressed through talking to them or through some sorts of external rewards and punishments, like not letting them have chocolate milk. And there wasn't this thinking that, oh, if somebody is out of line, just give them a pill. There was, I think, by the time of the early 2000s and even the late 1990s, so slightly before my time in high school, already a shift toward this over-reliance on psychotropic medications, where all of a sudden they became seen as a panacea. It became unfashionable to talk about essentially trying to solve problems by reference to, well, what behaviors are better, what behaviors are worse, what can you do as an individual responsibility. That was seen as kind of quaint and old-fashioned, unfortunately, because I very much still believed in that. I thought if people were troublemakers, real troublemakers, they had a share of responsibility for those activities. And let's say more traditional approaches tended to work better. But I think this paradigm also had a very insidious adverse effect in that it classified mere, let's say, neurodivergence or nonconformity as being problems that should be medicated away. And previously, people who were mildly neurodivergent were essentially allowed to be that way. And they should be allowed to be that way, because that's exactly how we get intellectual progress and innovation, and people who recognize the errors of a mainstream paradigm. So, very interesting comment from Jason. Sergei Gubkin writes, in his view, instead of trying to invent a happiness pill, he thinks it's better to focus on creating an environment that makes more people happy, as our internal states are strongly dependent on external circumstances. And I definitely agree with that observation. I think for a person who is generally of sound mind, feelings of a particular kind are not good or bad. They reflect external circumstances that are good or bad. So, for instance, if you lose a loved one, you should feel sad. You should feel profound and intense grief. And if you don't, then there's something wrong with you. But I think a lot of people today think you only should be feeling these lightly positive emotions all the time. And you should be kind of chipper, happy-go-lucky. And if you're not, then there's something wrong with you. And I think that's a very problematic mindset. Of course, it would be great if people could feel positive emotions with justification, but external circumstances should be good to merit that. And Sergey also writes, I understand we cannot invent a perfect world, and trying to create a perfect society has a horrible track record. For instance, trying to perfectly nurture humans, but we should focus on the external. And I would say, again, generally, I agree with that observation. We should try to improve the circumstances of our lives, and then we will feel better. There are some cases where people's feelings may not correspond to the external reality. And I think those are the cases where there would be other approaches, therapy being one of them, or more targeted medications. But I would invite anyone from HappyDAO to comment on these observations.
No, I definitely agree with it. I definitely agree with the fact that the sort of external factors in society need to be improved upon. There's no doubt about that. But that's a much more complicated problem to solve from an execution standpoint. I truly believe that in the next 10 to 20 years, we can invent medicine that works very well for patients. It works very well for patients. And I think that that's feasible. I think that that's a feasible thing that we're looking at. And as far as it goes with our mission, that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Yes, thank you, Namkhai. And Nahu also writes in our chat, one could make the same argument about someone who's morbidly obese and tell them to change their habits with diet and exercise. However, sometimes patients reach a point of no return and need medicine. So I think this is why Ozempic has been so successful, for example, because it has helped people in those circumstances who, for whatever reason, might not be able to reach a healthier state through habits alone. And I think that's a valid observation. Sometimes you do need both. It depends on the severity of the situation. It depends on other things that are happening in that person's life. So if that person is morbidly obese and he's a trucker, for instance, and he has to drive 12 hours per day for his day job, he doesn't have as much of an opportunity for exercise. He could do a little bit, walk around at the truck stops, maybe, but Ozempic could help him. Now, Ben, you said you have an additional comment to add, but it's up to you if you want to save it for later or do it now.
No, I'll just go quick. Many workplaces have like a mental health aid component to the benefits of working there. And I did see an article within the last few months that was saying that many employees, they just want their workplace to work better, and they'd be happier with that being the case rather than like this mental health kind of thing on the side. But then to your comment, Namkhai, it's hard to fix a business. You know, it's nice to have like this, to have both, to also have people that are just really struggling and be like, I need some consultation. Can I have that? But that's the thought that came to mind as you guys were sharing.
Yeah, when you have hundreds of millions of people around the world who are suffering from these things every day, creating an entire like societal reform on how everything is done in terms of workplace, whether that be school, social, so on, it's very difficult to do. That's a very tall task, oftentimes with little control that you can exert over the outcome. With medications, that's not the case. You can create medications that will help people address very specific problems in their life. And I just think that when you're looking at that many people, that seems to be more of a realistic solution.
Yes, thank you for that comment. And Nahu elaborated upon his previous remark with regard to people who are morbidly obese. He writes the same can be said for depression and anxiety. Most times it can be resolved by changing the environment or behavior, but chronic depression leads to biochemical changes in the brain that in fact require help. I'm wondering if there could be perhaps a more refined approach to essentially the level or the type of depression that might merit that. Because as we spoke prior to the start of the salon, a feeling of sadness does not equal depression, even a feeling of intense sadness. But depression could arise if these kinds of feelings prevent a person from functioning in crucial ways, prevent a person from performing necessary life tasks or interacting with other people productively. So I wonder also, with regard to this, some instances of depression can be addressed through behavioral or environmental changes, but where does one draw the line? Is there an easy way to draw the line, or is that in itself a question that requires additional research and serious investigation?
I would say that
So for
requires. Oh yeah, go ahead, Nahu.
now, you got it. So for right now, the DSM does a pretty good job of identifying, what it is to have chronic depression, over 3 years with X amount of symptoms, or how many symptoms that you have at one time can qualify you for these things. But again, they have to be more refined through our hopefully, suggested method, which would be PROs, patient-related outcomes. So if we can just, push that more and evaluate that along with the current guidelines, I believe we would have a more proper system.
So we rely then on the patients to tell us how severe their symptoms are, or how profoundly they're affecting those people's quality of life.
Yeah, and a part of that has to go with the rating scales that are used in conventional science, so to speak. I know that the current standard in place right now is the Montgomery-Asberg as well as the Hamilton Depression rating scale. Those rating scales depend super heavily on clinician-reported outcomes rather than patient-reported outcomes. And we view that as a problem. We view that as a really big problem because it doesn't give insight. And someone here just said the social stigma comes from the fact that people don't really understand depression. And that's true. That's a true statement. I couldn't agree more with that. That's why it's so important to implement a framework that really focuses on patient-reported outcomes. The most recent one is newer than the Montgomery and the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. It's called the SF-36. It's a 36-line item questionnaire given to patients during clinical trials to sort of assess their subjective response to these medications. I know that science tends to be against the subjectivity of it all, but with something like depression, something like anxiety, which are so subjective and they're so multifaceted, it's really important to rely on patient reported outcomes.
Definitely. And I think I also saw, Jason, your comment from YouTube regarding the education piece. And I think it's very important as well, that it's true that I also don't think that people actually largely know what it means to be depressed. And if they don't know, then of course it's even harder to relate to. And that means that they will have even more stigma of sharing their symptoms if people don't even know what they're feeling or don't understand it. So of course, it's very important. And for us, it's also an important part of our mission to also educate people about what it actually means. So both finding solutions, but also creating a supportive environment where people actually understand what it's all about. So external awareness globally is really important for us as well. And we would love for everyone to understand these issues and for the stigma to not be there anymore at all. And we want to get as close to that as we possibly can.
Mm-hmm. And that's another reason why having a community around this that has both scientists and researchers plus patients that's a symbiotic relationship right there, in that they can sort of give to one another and bridge those gaps in knowledge to help people become more informed. And in our case, become better informed in an effort to vote on bringing better drugs to market downstream from what we do, of course.
Yes, thank you for those responses. And it's interesting, Jason observes he doesn't understand how someone can have a train wreck of a life and not be depressed, and someone with a good life can be. And I think this is a situation where people's emotions are miscalibrated vis-a-vis the external reality. And those really are situations of depression because there might not be external justifications for those emotions. And that's where other methods could be more useful. But I do think it's important within both the medical system and within society to try to really understand the life circumstances of those people. Because if they say that they're depressed, could they also have real reasons to feel negative emotions? Like the loss of a loved one is an obvious example, but it could be, say, their job circumstances are suboptimal, or they're even feeling profound sadness and frustration at some societal phenomenon, perhaps the adverse effects of the pandemic or how certain people have been treated in the world have had an effect on those individuals' emotional states. And then it's not so simple as to say they're depressed. Maybe they have justified negative reactions to some very real phenomena. And I think that's important to consider as well. So now I wanted to open up the discussion to our other panelists. So Art Ramon, if you have a question or comment, please go ahead.
Yeah, my experience with, let's say, antidepressive drugs, I didn't take any until my mid-30s, though I probably could have used it back in high school because I had a lot of depression back then. I also wish I had discovered coffee back then. I would have done better in school because kind of a night owl and I never slept well. But what I took the first time taking antidepressants is because I was sort of self-medicating on my own with coffee and alcohol and another drug called, it was like a workout supplement that had ephedra in it. And I used to think very clearly with that stuff. The thing is that they pulled it off the market because a couple of individuals died, on a soccer match or something. The heart exploded, taking those ephedra-based pills. So they put it off the market. I had to get off of it. I was back in college at the time, and I had severe headaches, just severe headaches for about a year. And I had to do something because, I was back at the university and I needed to pass classes. And so I did go to the free psychiatrist, and they did give me Prozac, which worked well enough to get rid of the headaches and focus enough. So that was because like my entry into using antidepressant drugs, and I kind of continued using it and still do. But the other thing is that there's still a stigma because when I applied for a job back in 2010, it required a top secret clearance, and my top secret clearance was denied. And that was what they stated. I didn't give them enough information about the psychiatry, whatever I got. So yeah, there's still a stigma. So if you're out there and you're trying to get a top secret clearance, don't even put it there if you don't have to. They'll get you either way. You don't put it there in your applications, they'll deny you. You put it in there and don't get enough details, they'll deny you. So there still is a stigma. Now, another thing I wanted to bring up is that, economic singularity is coming. A lot of people are going to start losing their jobs over the next few decades, and they're going to be very depressed, when you lose your job and you don't have any other job to find. And, I sort of advocated for art therapy, but art therapy isn't going to work for everyone. So, and I assume that if they go to get some sort of public medical assistance, they're going to give them the cheapest drug out there, which is probably Prozac. So, yeah, I think there's a need to develop something better than Prozac, because one of the side effects I don't like from Prozac, yeah, it'll get rid of your depression, but it also gets rid of your drive to do much of anything, so that's why I quit taking that stuff. and I take bupropion. It's enough to get rid of depression, but it doesn't take away your drive. But there's going to be a need for something better than Prozac and cheaper in the coming decades. Because this is going to happen worldwide. People are going to start losing their jobs, and there will be no jobs. And we're going to have to make that transition. A lot of people might resort to suicide and other more destructive actions. What is your strategy? I mean, I'm sure this is coming. What's your strategy to try and help out or get involved with the unemployment issue that's coming?
From a medication standpoint, or?
Yes, just medication from the way your DAO is going to work. How are you trying to integrate your strategy with economic singularity?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't fully thought it through in terms of the economic singularity. But I would say that in terms of the R&D landscape, there's a lot of promising candidates out there to address very specific types of depression and anxiety. So, for example, I guess even then, in the case of something that happens downstream from like a personal economic standpoint, there could still be a different phenotype cluster involved. And that's really the bread and butter of all this, is creating solutions that effectively address very specific types of depression and anxiety. One of the biggest innovations going on right now is creating new drug delivery systems to mitigate side effects. So then people don't have to deal with those things like loss of drive and so on and so forth. I know that a company called Vistagen, they currently have a few drugs in stage 3 right now for social anxiety and for major depression. And how they've approached that is to use a nasal spray in which the drug can effectively reach the patient's brain and penetrate the blood-brain barrier much more seamlessly than, say, an oral medication would. And that's been shown to cause a lot less side effects, especially in terms of apathy, lack of drive, and so on.
Yeah, I also want to mention that in terms of your question, Art, is also the fact that we want the whole community to benefit from advancing this mission. So, for instance, also, as we alluded to before, in terms of like the data piece, that when we were able to offer patients to be able to provide their data for different trials, for instance, then we can also actually give them some incentives in return. That could be, for instance, some tokens they can get for basically providing value to a trial. So in that end, that could be something that could actually help them. And of course, also the whole crypto piece also means that we're able to offer staking benefits where people can lock their tokens for a period and they can get actually returns on that over time. So there are actually a few mechanisms there that can actually help the ones that want to stay engaged and actually want to help this mission. They can actually also be a part of basically seeing that the organization increases in value, and they can also benefit from becoming bigger and them participating in different ways. And also, a last thing is also the fact that a DAO also means that a lot of people can actually contribute, can actually get incentives in return. They can get, for instance, some tokens for actually providing value to the DAO in other ways than what I just mentioned. That can be, for instance, they put out a social media piece on the DAO that the DAO finds useful. They can get some token for that, for instance, or they do an interview for the DAO, or there are many different incentives there. So the thing with the DAO is also that it's very open and anyone can contribute. It's autonomous. So as long as people find valuable, they can actually get something in return for that.
Yes, thank you very much for those answers, Andreas and Namkhai. And Nahu says, thank you, Artemon, for explaining your personal experience with being on antidepressants, and Ben echoes that sentiment. Yes, I think it is quite important to find out from actual people who have experienced these medications what that's like, what the effects are like, what the side effects are like. This is very useful information. I think it's sometimes neglected in the mainstream media or the mainstream culture, even though these are the very people that are being impacted. Now, it's interesting too, Daniel Tweed points out physical pain signals the need to alter or move from one's environment, and mental pain should be recognized as having the same function. So negative emotions have a role as long as they provide you with a signal that something needs to change, or one needs to change oneself in some way, or there's a danger, there's a threat that one needs to respond to, but the emotions have to be accurate indicators of that in order for them to serve that role. Now, Jason says he doesn't understand how taking a drug that makes you feel a certain way literally all the time would work, and he would not want to feel the same all the time. So I think he's referring to the emotional blunting that happens with some of the SSRIs, and he wonders, does depression medication keep people from being happy also? It seems intuitive to him that being happy would need to be contrasted with some sort of sadness. And I think he's referring to the concept of an emotional set point. That is, most people have some sort of default emotional set point that they gravitate toward as a kind of response to normal circumstances. And if their circumstances improve or deteriorate from their baseline, then their emotions will respond to that, but only for a time. After a while, and actually a fairly short time, their emotions tend to return to that set point, adjusting to whatever their new default state might be. So, for example, my emotional set point on a scale from -10 to 10, I've said this before, is somewhere around a -1 or a -2. So mildly negative, which means I'm not depressed, but I'm the kind of person who can point to flaws in various situations. And I'm definitely not a happy-go-lucky kind of guy, but I am sufficiently motivated to act that I think, okay, I need to devote the majority of my time to addressing those flaws, to improving my situation. And I can bring about a lot of improvement, but after having done that, my emotional set point will still eventually return to the -1 or -2. So, for example, I had long COVID for a year between August of 2022 and approximately August of 2023. And of course, with long COVID, it doesn't disappear right away. It gradually asymptotically approaches zero if one is lucky. And I remember thinking in late 2022, I would do almost anything to get rid of this condition. I would give away pretty much all of the money that I had earned up to that time, start over as long as I had a guarantee of good health. And sometimes in recent months, I've reflected on this. After the long COVID essentially went away and I didn't have to give away all of my money, I essentially have right now what I had wished for so earnestly in late 2022. But on a day-to-day basis, my emotional set point is still around a -1 or -2. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does seem, to Jason's point, that there is this contrast of emotions that happens. And to really meaningfully depart from that set point, one needs to have some of that contrast, and one needs to learn to harness it constructively. But what does everyone else think of these observations, and how can a more innovative approach to mental health address them and take them into account?
Yeah, so circling back to my point about some of the new innovations on the market right now and what people in the community are trying to do, there's been an increased focus on small molecule drugs that are able to expedite neurogenesis and neuroplasticity in the brain, effectively helping patients rewire the way that they think, or more so just becoming more adept to change. So we really see that as an opportunity for people to make meaningful change in their lives and sort of rewire their brains in a way that they can retain even after discontinuing medication.
Yes, so the rewiring of the brain, that's a very promising possibility, and it would involve essentially advances in neuroscience and our understanding of brain chemistry. So could you perhaps characterize, at least in general terms, what do we know, we being the scientific community, fairly reliably, and what do we not know particularly well at all yet about these phenomena and how brain rewiring could occur?
There's a lot that's misunderstood, to be completely honest with you. As far as what I mentioned in terms of the novel solutions go, a lot of that change is being mediated through the activation of different neurosteroids in the brain to sort of increase the amount of growth factors you have and make change based on that. So you're pretty much, it's pretty much an anti-aging solution for the brain. And a lot of people here have commented on the mechanisms that cause depression and anxiety. That's not well understood at all. But from an endpoint point of view, we can sort of see that, there might be problems in the way that you think or that you function on an executive level. And these drugs can bring about those changes in a meaningful way, or so we believe so far based on the research that's out.
Yes, thank you for that response. Any further comments from anyone at HappyDAO on this question, generally, what we know, what we don't know about brain chemistry and how to effectively rewire the brain? All right. Well,
it sort of goes back to what I said. What the sort of meta has been so far for the last 50 years is the chemical imbalance theory of depression, which has been widely debunked. That is pretty much the theory under which SSRIs, MAOIs, and so on came to market. We're sort of starting to see that that's false. There's not a clear-cut answer as to what the solution to that is, but there are promising candidates that we believe have the potential to create change. Neurosteroids being the main one.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that response. And Daniel Tweed wonders why the emphasis on small molecule drugs. Is it because they're easier to synthesize or administer? And would caffeine be considered a small molecule drug? That's an interesting question, because caffeine, of course, for most people, caffeine gives the sensation of a mild energy boost, sometimes easier ability to focus, but it's probably the most commonly taken, somewhat mind-altering substance. So it might be interesting to hear your thoughts on caffeine as well, but the focus on small molecule drugs more generally would be interesting to discuss as to why that is indeed what HappyDAO is focusing on.
We're focusing on small molecule drugs because small molecule drugs have the potential to be far more selective and effective against these certain phenotype clusters than other solutions would. Small molecule drugs are defined usually as a medication that's below 900 Daltons in terms of the atomic weight, as well as drugs that have been chemically synthesized. I don't think caffeine would be considered a small molecule drug. I could be wrong on that, but I don't believe that it is.
All right. Thank you for that response. And Winning Streak writes, she has a good cure for depression. Go help someone else in a worse position than you think you are. Be treated by their turmoil. It works. Well, it's interesting if people have kind of a relative view and they start to see that relative to others, they're not doing that badly in terms of their life circumstances. I could see how that could work. It could lead to a shift in mindset, a reorientation away from whatever one happens to be feeling or struggling with toward the problems of someone who has it worse. So definitely worthwhile to try. And Ben also points out helping others makes one feel good, so that could counteract the negative feelings. Yes, I agree. Now, Ben, would you like to pose a question or make another comment?
I'll make the comment and then I'll find my question. We were talking about how physical pain causes motion to get away from the physical pain, and that mental pain would be kind of the same thing. Maybe it was about a decade ago. I went off on a kind of my last big foray before now planting in Madison, Wisconsin. And before I left, I was like, I got to leave some emotions that like just hang on to me too long on the shore and just don't pick them up when I come back to the States. Those four emotions were worry, envy, judgment, guilt, and I kind of made it WEJG and called them wedge. And I was like, those emotions, I can recognize them, but I can't like hold on to them. I did add bitterness and frustration to those. And I know I feel these things, but it's kind of like I'm not allowed to like hang on to them. If I recognize them within me, I got to do something, let them go, because they never help me long term. And if I can recognize them and act to change, I'll be better off. But anyway, let's see some questions here. So we did mention CureDAO today already. And Mike Sin, we had Gennady, I'm sure you can pull up the broadcast that we had a couple years back. I wondered if you'd had any collaboration with Mike Sin or CureDAO or other people in our community, about HappyDAO.
Yes, so we actually have talked to Mike Sin about the project, and he is focusing on some other things right now. So for him, it wasn't really possible for him to help out at this stage, but he's very supportive of the mission, and he also was sharing that on social media as well about what we're trying to do. So he's still very supportive, and who knows, maybe in the future he will be able to help with this initiative as well. So we are actually also in contact with David Pierce as well. He's got a huge community focusing on super happiness, one of the core transhumanist levers. So we are in communication with him, and he's very supportive as well about the project. And then various individuals in the space we're talking to, and we are trying to get as much feedback as possible on all this. So we are right now having a core focus on creating the white paper, and we have a good draft together, but we want to get as many opinions in to make sure that we build the foundation right. So we have gotten I think more than 80 people already looking through it, and we are still adding more people to get more feedback. So if anyone is interested in taking a look and giving their thoughts or ideas, anything, we'd love to have anyone included in that as well. You can reach out to any of us to ask for access. But yeah, we are definitely open to more collaboration within the community as well. And if you have any ideas, suggestions on that, we'd love to know. But for now, that's what we have in terms of collaboration here in the community.
Thank you, Andreas. And I do encourage everyone to watch our virtual Enlightenment Salon on CureDAO from August 7th, 2022. I think it's a fascinating concept, and really that implementation could revolutionize how patient data are utilized for improved health and longevity. So I do hope that Mike Sin will get back to it at some point. But in the meantime, thank you for the update, Andreas, and I appreciate the willingness to collaborate with others like Mike himself. Ben, it seemed like you had multiple questions, so please go ahead.
I always have multiple questions, Gennady. All right, number 2. Andreas, you know your DAOs. To you, why are DAOs the best, or at least one of the best instruments for promoting research in a given area?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for me, it kind of comes down to the whole issues with the current scientific system, I would say. I wouldn't necessarily say the process in all areas, but more the whole system, how it's set up. And so some of the core issues, of course, the one I mentioned before about the incentives not being in place for the actual people that make the discoveries and actually push this forward. Besides that, we have paywalls behind every single platform. So people are not able to willingly access and share their data and their research. They're not collaborating. Again, incentives are not there. So for me, the whole driver behind DeSci is about making all of this collaborative and open. And the thing is, to achieve anything significant, you need a lot of people. And if you have all these silos, then it's not really going to happen. Or if it's going to happen, it's going to take so much longer than if you put all efforts together. So when you see a mass of millions of people working together, you can achieve pretty much anything. But if you're just a small bunch of people, it's much harder, and you can still work really hard, but it's going to be really hard to keep up with a million people or beyond. So that's the thing with a DAO, is then that you have that possibility of actually having millions of people in one DAO, and they can all add values into different degrees over different given amount of time. The thing is, they can join in once a year and say hi, and even that's some kind of value for basically creating some engagement. Or they can be full-time on the project, help moving forward. They can share it with friends. There are many different things they can actually do to drive this forward. So the whole DAO mechanism is a really amazing way to actually incentivize collaboration and support among people. And the DeSci space is already very collaborative in its approach, and people are really focusing on trying to find different synergies and similarities, and there is always a focus on trying to drive efforts forward together. So we're also talking to different DeSci DAOs already that are also focusing on different efforts. For instance, and there is another DAO that's also focused on mental health, that's PsyDAO, focused on psychedelics. So with them, we are right now exploring synergies, and we are probably going to do a debate with them in a few weeks on Twitter Spaces. And we're basically going to try to compare the HappyDAO approach versus the psychedelic approach, and see how they could work together, and why we are choosing the different approaches to achieve positive benefits in anxiety and depression and other disorders for them. So we are exploring many different collaboration opportunities, and yeah, for the whole DAO piece, I think that's an amazing lever that really gotta maximize collaboration to really achieve exponential progress and getting patients better treatments as soon as we possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I would really like to hear this debate that you will have, because, of course, between the HappyDAO approach and the psychedelic approach, I would be greatly in favor of the HappyDAO approach. I think people know me as a skeptic of psychedelics, but I've heard others talk about their benefits. I just see, one, the loss of control, and two, the attendant toxicity of a lot of psychedelic drugs as being far more severe downsides. And I think if one is going to take a chemical or pharmaceutical approach, one needs that approach to be as targeted as possible. And
Exactly.
going on a trip is not anyone's definition of a targeted approach. But I would be quite fascinated to hear this kind of debate. And Nahu writes that most of the DeSci DAOs are what many would consider fringe topics, such as mental health, hair loss, longevity. These are typically not addressed by traditional medicine. DeSci allows one to actively participate and shine light to an issue that could affect you. And yes, that's definitely an important observation. I think a lot of the time, the issues we all have with pharmaceutical companies tend to stem from the fact that they're pursuing the largest market they could possibly get. And that means focusing on the most common issues, but also often neglecting a lot of issues that do affect many people, but maybe not as many as, say, obesity or cancer. And as a result, those issues get left by the wayside. There's a huge problem, for instance, in terms of so-called orphan diseases that don't really have a drug that's developed specific to them, even though in totality, these orphan diseases affect huge swaths of the population. So DAOs could definitely be crucial components of the solution. Now, I also wanted to bring forth this question from Fleury, who wonders if focusing on dopamine as much as on serotonin could help in creating an effective antidepressant. What are your thoughts on this?
So that was pretty much how antidepressants came into fruition, for a matter of fact, in the 50s with the development of MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. The main way in which you would achieve a sort of holistic, because I do see merit there, one of the big problems with SSRIs is that when you take them, you're skewing your serotonin so far into the right, whereas the other monoamines might get less attention, and then that can create some imbalance. Researchers don't actually know the full reason as to why SSRIs cause so many side effects. It's not fully understood, alongside all the other neurotransmitter transporter inhibitors, so to speak. So that could be a good solution for a lot of people. Yeah. The problem with that is when you're looking at 50 to 100 million people who have depression, inhibiting monoamine oxidase has a lot of side effects. It has a lot of side effects in terms of serotonin toxicity, hypertensive crisis, and so on. And for a matter of fact, these drugs actually got pulled off the market for a little bit because they're so considered so dangerous. The amount of dietary and lifestyle changes you'd have to make in order to accommodate that uptick in all three of the major monoamines, it's pretty significant.
Yes, thank you for that response. Again, it does seem like in that situation, the risks would outweigh the benefits. Now, Mike Lazine wonders, it seems that having oral medications going through the bloodstream can cause more harm than good with certain drugs. Is it the case that if the drug somehow went straight to the brain, that would cause many fewer side effects? And if so, what would cause that difference, if there is a difference?
Yeah, it's certainly a good question, and this is something that, like I said before, it's a huge focal point for the community, is finding new drug delivery systems where you can bypass certain areas of metabolism that break it down and might cause some physiological side effects, which is a big thing in SSRIs and SNRIs, of course, with weight gain, GI issues, and so on. There have been positive outcomes associated with delivering the drug directly to the brain. So you can bypass the liver, any potential hepatotoxicity, and things of that nature can be mitigated by doing that.
Yes, thank you for that response. Also, an interesting observation by Daniel Tweet. The mission of philosophy is an ever deeper understanding of human happiness. Human civilization needs more philosophy and philosophers and fans of the same. And I think our virtual Enlightenment salons attempt to bring this about and spread the appreciation of philosophy to anybody who will listen, and of course integrate that into a variety of discussions about as many areas of human life and endeavor as we can find people willing to discuss. So philosophy, in my view, is crucial for individuals to pursue. Everyone really has a philosophical approach toward life. The only area of that one can control is whether that approach is implicit or explicit. And sometimes people can make mistakes if they implicitly adopt a philosophical framework that doesn't really fit reality or their surroundings. So I wonder, in terms of the future arsenal of tools to address mental health challenges or prevent or cure some of these conditions, what role would philosophy play in your understanding? Because in my understanding, I think it would be quite significant. A person with the correct philosophical outlook, at least correct for them, if you want to see it that way, could avoid or overcome a lot of these challenges, I would expect.
Yeah, I would agree. I would personally agree with that. And you sort of see a direct relationship between the amount of people who are depressed and then the decline in religion. So that's an interesting point as well. As far as it goes with sort of rolling that out at scale, though, that would be a hard thing to do because something like that would require a profound change in public sentiment.
Yes, it is hard to enable everybody to become a philosopher. I would want that.
Yeah.
And in my youth, when the early internet was still very much flourishing, so this was before the rise of social media, where you had a lot of decentralized websites, I was very optimistic that the internet would create essentially a mass enlightenment through the dissemination of information free of cost, free of barriers, so that anybody could find the truth and anybody could enjoy the most profound works of philosophy, literature, art, poetry, what have you, for free. And unfortunately, what we saw is even with the availability of that information, the effect of a mass enlightenment did not occur.
Yeah.
And why that did not occur is, of course, a whole separate discussion that we could have for hours. But I can definitely see your point, Namkhai, that for many people, unfortunately, philosophy is not going to be the sole route toward achieving meaningful improvements in their lives, just because I think for a lot of them, they don't have the preparation yet to appreciate it, which is sad. But we need to keep laying the groundwork to enable them to appreciate it. But nonetheless, other means need to be pursued as well. So we have more commentary from Nahu about the previous question from Mike Lazine. And Nahu writes that the blood-brain barrier, or lipophilic versus bloodstream or hydrophilic approaches to medication delivery both have pros and cons, and we simply need more research and development, hence the purpose of HappyDAO. That makes sense. And Ben pointed out in our internal chat that the internet gave people the choice between free philosophy and free something else, which is a lot more abundant on the internet, unfortunately, and some people, many people inclined in the other direction. So I suppose that is one contributing factor, but then we have to ask, well, why? And again, this is a longer discussion, and I don't expect us to answer this conundrum in the next 20 minutes, but why isn't it that more people are not enthusiastic about philosophy than they are about other matters? So Daniel has an interesting quotation from Nietzsche, or actually from Kenneth Smith. For Nietzsche is utterly correct. Philosophy is only for the healthy and whole-minded. The sick it has always only made even sicker. Very interesting. So how do we help the people who are sick? And that is a profound discussion that we are having right now. So in terms of HappyDAO's governance, we always ask our DAO guests how they envision their organization being run, because harnessing the benefits of all of this decentralized research and insight can be hard, and it does require decision making. So how would it work in HappyDAO?
Yes, so this is something that we are still exploring a lot because there are actually many governance issues in DeSci already. There are many projects where you see that a few token holders, they have 80%, 50% of the total outstanding supply. And that means that even though anyone can vote and actually put up proposals, if you get that majority just to decide everything, then they're always gonna basically steer the ship, and no one and the community is not really gonna get involved. So, and that happens when people have this one vote, per one token. So that could be quite an issue. So it's the most simple way of doing it, but it certainly has flaws. So we are exploring other ways of doing it. For instance, two that are very interesting to me is quadratic voting as well as reputation-based voting. But we are still investigating that, and we definitely want a lot of feedback to make sure we understand this in the best way possible, because we really want to minimize all these issues that we have seen in other DAOs, and we really want to maximize all the strengths we have seen too. So this is something we have to explore further, and this is probably something that's going to change over time as well, so we can always give the community the say that it deserves. Because yes, it's kind of, for me, it's kind of sad when I've seen some proposals where you have maybe 35 community members voting against something, then you have maybe like 3 people that will vote for, and they have so many tokens that they just still decide that the proposal actually passes. Stuff like that. I don't want to see that within HappyDAO. So I think it's really important that we really focus on the best practices, and we have different people we're talking to, and we're evaluating this with to figure out the best way to do this. And it's a very important piece. So thank you for emphasizing that, Janity.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Andreas. And my understanding of quadratic voting, which we discussed previously with VitaDAO as well, is that essentially in order to have twice the voting power, you would have to dedicate 4 times the value of a single vote. And then in order to have 3 times the voting power, you'd have to dedicate essentially 9 times the value of a single vote. So you can have more influence, but you would need to expend at each increment more votes in order to have them count to a certain extent. So it's not like if you have 51% of the shares or the votes in a DAO, you always win, because that quadratic element essentially gives you diminishing returns. And that means this is a kind of a hybrid system in effect between simple one man or one person, one vote, and a system where it's one share, one vote. So there's a kind of intermediate approach. Now, with regard to permutation voting that you mentioned, would these be like the various ranked choice voting systems or transferable vote systems? I would just like an elaboration on the term as you're using it.
Yes, so it's basically based on what the DAO deems each individual's reputation to be. So if people have done a lot of good work and made a lot of contributions, they will have a higher say over the direction of the organization. And if they have made a lot of bad choices or haven't really added a lot of value, they will have less so. And one other thing is also the fact that I think it's also very important that one evaluates decisions and proposals in terms of the qualifications of each decision maker. So if you have, say, 100 people that can all vote, but only 10 of them actually understand the proposal, if everyone votes for, and those 10 people, they vote against because they actually understand it, it could be a huge issue as well. So expertise can also be a big play here, which is where, yeah, these decisions are quite complex. And that's also why even considering voting of proposals where you have maybe just people that have, say, passed a specific guide on this topic or something can actually take part. So it could be kind of gated by a specific amount of knowledge, because otherwise you could actually have a DAO that determines the wrong decisions because they basically don't understand what the proposal is all about. So that could be basically encouraging education to get access to that kind of proposal. It could just be a small course or whatever you can actually go through to understand. You actually get access to those. So I think this is a very, very important topic. And I think, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are many issues in the space about the whole voting process, also in other DAOs outside of DeSci as well. So we have to constantly try to optimize our approach here and really consider a lot of people's takes and efforts in this, because we definitely don't want any big issues to occur from proposals that's going to happen within HappyDAO.
Yes, indeed. And Ben points out this seems to be somewhat meritocratic in that the people who have more knowledge or more involvement in an area would get more voting power, but it seems it could vary by decision as well. And it's interesting that you mentioned essentially having people take some sort of course to demonstrate their knowledge or capability. And this is actually an area we have explored within the US Transhumanist Party. We haven't implemented it as of this time because getting the proper course sequence developed would be extremely important before we even consider conditioning a greater amount of voting power on that. But it does give more recognition to people who know the subject matter. And I do think that could lead to a higher quality of decisions. Now, we do, of course, with any sort of governance situation, need to be concerned about protecting the organization from bad actors. And after 7.5 years as chairman of the US Transhumanist Party, I have seen my fair share of bad actors. If you stay long enough in a leadership role in an organization, this is going to happen to you as well, in terms of understanding or experiencing some of the ways in which people might try to subvert an organization or just cause trouble for it. And to this point, Transhumanist TV writes that in their view, DAOs are so easily subverted by bad actors, and he is glad that you acknowledge that. Mike Lazine writes, aren't DAOs a form of democracy? If so, then you will have bad actors. Bad actors cannot be avoided unless you force everyone to be benevolent. And as I've said, if one remains long enough in a leadership role, one will encounter the bad actors. The question is, how do you prevent them from doing damage to the organization? And I'm wondering what the HappyDAO approach would be in terms of any formal mechanisms, how the DAO is designed, or just how you will respond if there is a bad actor in this space?
Yes, so it's of course, it's as you alluded to, it's normal for that to happen. There are always going to be people that are going to be supportive and people that are not, and even just the fact that, of course, over time there can be a lot of money in the system of HappyDAO going out to different projects, and if people are incentivized by money and want to try to take those that have been seen in other DAOs, of course. This is something that doesn't actually happen that often as one might think if one is actually working in a DAO and actually exploring the space. This is more what you see sometimes in news, where you see this DAO now got hacked, or this proposal passed that basically made them lose half the assets or something. So it's happened a few times, but not very often. But of course, this also means that even though it's a small chance, we're still, of course, got to minimize the chance of that ever happening. And this is also why, again, I think governance is really important in this aspect, because the the governance process will basically usually determine whether these things will happen or not, because it's usually about money or investment. It's about organizational structure that could basically halt the process of progress of the DAO, or completely maybe destroy it altogether. So this is why designing that in the best way possible, I feel like, is an integral part of avoiding bad actors. And of course, there can come people inside the community that can start spreading misinformation, or they can start creating scam in the community, and they can try to persuade people to join that and then lose their money, which they might say is created by HappyDAO. So those kind of things can definitely happen, but that's also why we got to really be clear in terms of communication of what is actually created by the DAO and what is not. And we got to be on top of all the communication that is happening within all the platforms people are talking about the DAO. Because of course, the bigger it grows, the more communication there will be about the DAO. And so this is why we need to have people on top of this. We need to have moderators that can observe all these different things, and they can stop this before it progresses further. And we need to have all these social media channels observed. So none of these things will happen. But again, as I alluded to, I think the core drive of this is definitely the governance, setting that up right, because it's usually where people, they might be able to buy in, say, a few $1 million, then they might get a majority in the DAO, and then they can basically make any decision they want. So this is also why designing this properly is really important in terms of the power of each token, as well as the fact of how we're going to allocate our supply. So if you're gonna allocate our supply slowly, we can avoid this much quicker, because there won't be enough in the system people to buy them all up and basically change the whole structure. So I would say those are the kind of the core things for avoiding that.
Yes, thank you for that answer. And it's clear that you have thought this through. Nahu also points out we've even begun to see pharmaceutical companies try to infiltrate DAOs. Their incentives may not be aligned with the communities. However, both are needed for the goal to succeed. And yes, this is where a fine balancing act is necessary, because we don't want the conventional mindsets as well as the short-term profit motive of the pharmaceutical industry to predominate. On the other hand, we will need the pharmaceutical industry at some point to manufacture a lot of these drugs. And that is the case for longevity drugs as well. So it's important to figure out a way for the small, innovative organizations to maintain their integrity, their visionary focus, ideally keep their founders on board as well, instead of having the founders be expelled by more mainstream actors later on, as often happens with startups. But on the other hand, one of the goals is to get these approaches to become the new mainstream, which means at some point, some entity is going to have to manufacture enough medicines or devices, or provide the resources for enough procedures that all of these innovations could be adopted. So how do we strike that balance? And how do we maintain the independence of thinking within a DAO, such as HappyDAO, but many of the others we've mentioned as well. And Ben also writes, in his experience, Big Pharma, more often than not, contracts out to manufacturers. So it may be that we need the manufacturing capacity. We might not need the big pharma corporation as such, but I would welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, so the question is basically about how you balance the big pharma and smaller entities in terms of structuring the whole clinical trial process as well as pipeline of new drugs.
Yes, and how, if there needs to be at some point in time a collaboration with Big Pharma, how does one prevent Big Pharma from essentially taking over? How does one find a win-win partnership, in essence, that doesn't involve Big Pharma taking control of the DAO, as Big Pharmas have done with regard to a lot of small startups? How do the founders remain in place, for example? How do they retain the ability to pursue their vision, even though they have collaborations with Big Pharma?
Yeah, it's a very good question, very important question too. So of course, right now in the DeSci space, there isn't enough money to be able to go straight from preclinical research until basically putting new drugs into patients. So right now, big pharma is basically needed for that to happen because there's simply not money, enough money in the system. But over time, I would say that hopefully we could take it all the way from the beginning to the end. And of course, until that is possible, it would be, of course, very important to assess each project in terms of collaboration as well as. So if, say, Big Pharma, they buy up the IP that HappyDAO has developed through a project investment, then yeah, they could definitely buy it up to take it all the way to human trials and to hopefully get that to market to create better treatments for patients. And so in those agreements, of course, it's very important that we set that up properly. And we could, for instance, have a mechanism in there where we could basically have them promise to not just discard this and actually take it all the way through trials and actually put this out to patients if it actually has viable success. Because of course this happens too, that they don't want the system to change, so they buy up the IP, but they just discard everything, and they actually don't develop it. Actually, saying they will. So if you have that in a legal agreement, we can actually ensure that it happens. So I think it's very important that those kind of things are set up, as well as just talking to the people and having mutual agreement and trust, so we can make sure that we will achieve the goals of HappyDAO by actually creating better drugs for patients.
Yeah, and there's plenty of smaller biotechs that we hope on collaborating with. Our main thing is that with the sale or licensing of IP, we do want the sort of recipient of that to be strategically aligned with HappyDAO, in that we're obsessively focused on patient outcomes.
Excellent. And focusing on patient outcomes is indeed the way to go. So thank you very much to Andreas, Namkhai, and Nahu for joining us today. We had a wide-ranging discussion from just our overall views of conditions like depression and anxiety, to the shortcomings of the current mainstream paradigm, to how the drugs of the future could potentially be better, as well as aspects of the DAO's structure and governance and collaborations. So I really appreciate the broad multidisciplinary approach. We brought philosophy in, which is what our virtual enlightenment salons are all about. And in the last 30 seconds or so, any three of you have any final words to offer to our audience? Anything else you would like our viewers to know?
Yeah, I definitely just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for watching this. And if you're interested in any aspects of what we're trying to build, we would definitely love to have you on board and love to help you create this together with us. And please tell everyone you know about our approach if you like it. We are up for anyone to help this. We need a collective to make this happen.
Yes, indeed. And please
right.
do reach out to HappyDAO on Discord as well as on Twitter. And I think if you succeed, then more and more people will be able to happily live long and prosper.
That's right.